I hope that you had a great week, great weekend. On Friday, some pretty crazy things happened this weekend. In the Cannabis Control Commission. Um, is anybody here aware of what was going down? Okay. All right. So I'm gonna try to explain this to you guys in a way, because this topic we're gonna talk about it in like 3 weeks, but I'm gonna give it to you a little bit early. Okay. Are you ready? And it's actually in the bottom of the class, but I can't wait. All right. So in Massachusetts, because they recognized that the war on drug was terrible and that it literally created some problematic issues in communities, and problematic is an understatement, right? It created some real issues, from economically devastating these neighborhoods to the psychological impacts of having broken homes. The list goes on. So Massachusetts is like, okay, so we are legalizing marijuana. We've got to do something to kind of make up for what happened with the enforcement of the marijuana laws. So they created, this is only an adult use marijuana program, you guys. It does not apply to medical, which is another reason why I'm salty / don't like medical, but not because I don't like patients like the patient advocates like to say. It's because I don't like the program. The program's whack. All right. So there's no equity at all for medical, but let's move to adult use. So in adult use, they said a few things. They said they have an economic empowerment program, which we're not going to talk, and they have a social equity program. So those two programs are the programs that the state has instituted in order to make amends for the war on drugs. The economic empowerment program gives you priority when you apply. So when you apply to the Cannabis Control Commission, they'll just review, they'll put your application at the top and they'll review it. It'll be one economic empowerment applicant and one medical. We're gonna go over this, okay? This is just a little seasoning before everything gets really marinated later on, okay? So we're following, right? You got economic empowerment, and then you have social equity applicants. The social equity program was designed to help those who either have a marijuana charge, whose siblings or spouse has a marijuana charge, got it? Or those who live in one of 29 neighborhoods that the state has identified as being the most impacted by the war on drugs based on arrest records. Y'all following? I gotta give you guys this background so that you can know what went down on Friday. Otherwise, you'd have to wait till 3-4 weeks to get this information. All right. So the state says we have social equity, we have economic empowerment certificates. What I'm gonna do for y'all, okay, these certificate holders, I'm actually going to reserve 2 license types, okay? Delivery and social consumption. The CCC said when those license types gets issued for the next 2, before the law was changed on Friday, you had 2 years exclusivity. That means for 2 years, only economic empowerment, social equity, and a group, micro businesses, we'll talk about it, are able to deliver directly to consumers. But when the CCC wrote the law, Big Mama had some issues with it. And now you're probably talking about, Big Mama, you nice. How you have issues with things? Listen up, this is what they did. They said, if you're a delivery company, you are only permitted to deliver products from a licensed retail dispensary. You cannot deliver from a wholesaler. So now what does that mean? That means you as a delivery company, you have to buy products that a dispensary bought from a wholesaler at elevated rates, right? And the only amount that you're going to be making is the delivery charge. So essentially what the CCC had given exclusivity for is an Uber Eats license, right? Is the equivalent. You can't make money off of that. And the licensing process is expensive. It takes a long time. And we're going to get down to it maybe 3 weeks before the semester's over. We're going to start talking about taxation, how there's IRS code 280E that impacts retail, which causes retail stores to have an effective tax rate of about 70%. Y'all following? So they had this equity provision that was giving access to delivery licenses. The delivery licenses were whack. You weren't going to be able to make money off of it. So people started lobbying, including Big Mama. And we were and we were like, this can't be. And so on Friday, the Cannabis Control Commission voted to remove the requirement that you deliver directly from dispensaries. They can now deliver from wholesalers and vendors, and they can warehouse. You guys, I don't know if your mind's not blown in terms of business. If you're following what's happening in the world, who's going to retail mortar stores? Even before COVID, stores were shutting down, brick and mortars, because we the people don't like to put our clothes in bodies, stuff them in cars, drive them to whack ass locations, deal with people we don't want, to strangers. You know what I'm saying? We don't want to do that anymore. Like we rather just stay home, order things. Isn't that what's good? Isn't that the future? So Massachusetts, not only did they now change the game for delivery, for retail, because you must imagine, if you're a company who spent millions of dollars getting a brick and mortar business, you're a little upset right now. I know I would be, but even though I did spend a little bit of money to get my business started, but Big Mama know how to hustle, so she didn't break the bank to get to where I'm at. So that's what went down. Also, another thing, they extended the exclusivity period from 2 years to 3 years. So if you guys are in this class right now, you do not know any economic empowerment certificate holders. You do not know any social equity holders. Y'all don't know any of them? The reason I'm asking is you need to be friends with them and start a business with. Yes, I see a raised hand. So we can get started into this class. So for those who were not in the class last week, please watch the video on Blackboard. I uploaded it. It's extremely important that you get this information. I personally think that what I spoke about last week and what I'm going to talk about today are part of the most important things that you're going to need to know for the industry, because as you can tell, companies that don't understand the culture and don't understand the history of prohibition, their companies end up suffering. I'm just going to drop some shade and just say MedMen because we already saw what happened to them. Why? Because they thought that you could just throw money at things and not really respect and understand and appreciate the culture. So tonight, y'all about to probably go and Google MedMen. Like, what'd they do? Why Big Mama got coming for them? Okay. Ned was like, who's Big Mama? Oh, man, this is great. All right, screen share. All right, you guys. So last week, what we talked about, we went over the State of the Union. We talked about the marijuana markets. We talked about the Controlled Substances Act. We did some basic definitions of what marijuana is. We talked about what hemp is. And for you, Ned, quick definition of marijuana versus hemp. Does anybody remember what the difference between marijuana and hemp is? If you can, please shout it out. Just THC. You're correct in the sense that they're saying that it's non-psychoactive, but really it just has 0.3% THC or less. No. So that's the biggest difference. So I'm trying to see if I can see your faces simultaneously. And Big Mama did it. Let me tell you something about when you set your mind to something, you achieve it, okay? So that was the biggest difference between marijuana and hemp. Hemp is currently legal now. There's no federal prohibition against hemp because our good friend McConnell, who some would like to call the turtle, got together with his friends and decided that it's not fair that American farmers do not get to benefit from the cultivation of hemp, and they legalized hemp in 2018. And so now hemp, including CBD produced from hemp that was cultivated legally in the United States, are legal in the United States. What else did we talk about last week? We talked about the marijuana markets. We talked a little bit about taxation. We talked about the Controlled Substances Act, how we have 5 categories, and the placement of marijuana into Schedule 1 is extremely ridiculous because it has no potential for abuse as it doesn't really have potential for abuse. We know the pharmacological effects are beneficial. So it doesn't really fit any of the things we had discussed last week that would lead them to put it into the Controlled Substances Act. We talked about how is it that we talked about the tension between the federal and state rights, and how we the people gave the states some power, and the states gave the feds the power, and the feds then said that if we say any of the feds, the Constitution then said, if we speak on anything, right, the federal government has the right to speak on anything. States, you can't talk. And since the federal government has the right to regulate interstate commerce and the sale of marijuana impacts interstate commerce, that is how the federal government is able to regulate marijuana. Y'all remember this? Okay, good. I just want to make sure that I don't leave anything out. Yep, we talked about how this Emperor Sheng, he's been using marijuana since 8000 BCE. I have to bring up the 8000 BCE because it's ridiculous that people are still in prison for it when we know that it's been really helpful since 8000. We talked about Christopher Columbus using it to discover America. Oh, you guys, I forgot to mention something. We have a special guest coming tonight. Remember I told you guys the syllabus is a flowing syllabus, very much so like life. It's unpredictable. There you go. So tonight we have actually a very special guest coming. His name is Ulysses Youngblood. And if you've been on my website, you'll realize that is the president of Major Bloom. So that's my business partner. And he's going to come and talk about his experience with the criminal justice system and his experience with the police, with cannabis, and how we got together as a business and as business partners, and tell you guys the story of Major Bloom, if you guys care to know. Otherwise, you have no choice. You have to watch it anyways. Remember we talked about Harry Anslinger? Okay, good. We ended up we're almost there. Aki. All right. All right, you guys. At the end of class last week, we had gotten to the point where I'd finished talking about how the LaGuardia report came out. Remember the LaGuardia report? So at class, we were talking about how marijuana is beneficial, yet the federal government had no idea, right? They had no idea that it was actually a very good drug. That's a lie. Because LaGuardia, the mayor of New York, conducted research in 1944, and they got together with the New York Academy of Medicine. So these are really prominent and professional people. They came out with a report saying that marijuana did not have the deleterious impacts that we claimed that they claimed that it had. And what happened? What did Harry Anslinger do? Does anybody remember? Close. Anslinger was like, because no one is allowed to conduct research on marijuana without getting permission from the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which effectively did what? Shut down cannabis research in America, right? Good. So I kind of want to start with the 60s. And do you guys have any questions from last week? No? Good. All right. So let's get into the 1960s. Most people may not realize, but in the 1960s, they started viewing drug abuse as a social disease, right? They weren't really throwing people in jail for heroin or any kind of opioids. They were really trying to assess it. And this was a deviation from what we had seen previously, right? Where they were just criminalizing people for drug use. So before the war on drugs began in the 70s, American policymakers viewed drug as social disease like alcoholism that should be dealt with by treating the underlying addiction. This is the 60s, y'all. A reform process started in the 60s that adopted this medical legal view of drug policies, and they enacted laws that reflected this approach. And some of you guys will be surprised that even Richard Nixon's administration initially adopted this medical legal view of drug abuse and viewed it as a health problem. And they actually called for education and scientific research to learn about the dangerousness of drugs. Ain't that wild? Even some people we view as evil has some good things they were trying to do, you know? You got to look at the whole being. Okay. Drug abuse is socially, so there, again, as this, you remember from last week, I keep repeating there was a heroin crisis, opioid crisis. Doesn't it feel like the world has been in a perpetual opioid kind of heroin crisis? It's almost as if we as a human race need to sit back and reassess why we have created a society that's forcing us to escape all the time. But I ain't gonna talk about it, because then people are gonna say you're trying to restructure the world, tell me I'm Illuminati. I ain't doing that. Let's get back to 1960s drug abuse. Viewed as social disease. Okay, heroin. So heroin is a big issue. Then, and one of the things was in the 1960s, the heroin surged because soldiers were returning from war and they were being exposed to it overseas. And so previously, a lot of the drug abuse was doctor driven. This one was the one that was victimizing poor inner city neighborhoods. Before it was rich people who could access doctors and such. All right. So have you guys heard of the Narcotics Addict Rehabilitation Act, NARA of 1966? So when heroin use started increasing, the government passed this law in order to kind of deal with it. And what it did was it reflected this medical view of drug abuse that I was talking about. And it provided for the diversion of drug users into programs to treat the underlying addiction rather than prosecute them in the criminal justice system. Y'all following? So under this act in 1966, you get arrested for marijuana or you get arrested for narcotics. And instead of being dragged to jail, you get the option of going into a program where you get rehabilitation. Doesn't that sound humane? It does, doesn't it? Okay. You guys, I want us to follow where we are right now. So in 1937, remember the Tax Act was enacted? And the Tax Act effectively was the first federal law that banned marijuana in the United States effectively, because the tax associated with registration to get the registration was very high. But you guys, in 1969, two things happened. In 1969, we went to the moon, right? And we also got to get high, right? Because in 1969, Timothy Leary, he's one of those guys. You got to bow before him. Timothy Leary is this dude. He, I believe he's from Massachusetts, and he was arrested for possession of marijuana in violation of the 1937 Tax Act. But he argued that if the act violated his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, because abiding by it would require him to register to obtain a marijuana tax stamp that would thereby announce his intention to commit a crime. Ain't that crazy? And on May 19, 1969, the Supreme Court of the United States held that the Marijuana Tax Act was unconstitutional and Americans all over could spark up. But then our good friend Nixon said, not so fast. You thought, okay? You thought you had it. Okay, let's get into what happened. Okay, so as soon as this hits in 1969, Timothy Leary, our hero, got us for weed. But then Richard Nixon came through, and his administration drafted the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention Act of 1970. In 1970, Nixon signed the act, and it contained provisions that softened the drug laws, okay? They repealed mandatory minimums for drug offenses. It recategorized possession of a controlled substance as a misdemeanor. and provided probation for first-time offenders. So one thing I like to point out to people, the CSA as written was not as onerous as it is now. As you'll see, the Controlled Substances Act got terrible when Reagan got in office, but that's only because, you know, he had a horrible law that he initiated involving criminal justice, and we're going to talk about it. But so Title II of the 1970 Act was the Controlled Substances Act. All right, so the CSA, like I mentioned in the beginning of class last week, the CSA established 5 drug regulation schedules based on their medical values and potentials for addiction. Schedule 1, it was reserved for the most serious drugs, okay, which purported again to have a high potential for abuse, not have no accepted medical use. I don't understand how they could put their mouths together to write that it had no accepted medical use. When we talked about last week in 1836, William Shaughnessy, he was doing medical research in India. It's to the point where Queen Victoria was taking it, remember? So how can you tell me there's no medical research, Richard Nixon? But that's besides the point. You guys are like Big Mama. You get too emotionally involved in these. You got to get the class going, and I get you. Let me keep going. But don't tell me how to teach my class. All right, okay. Absence of any accepted use or benefit in medically supervised treatment. That means that even if a doctor is administering it to you, it's still too dangerous. That's crazy. Okay. So do you guys, what most people don't know is that Congress temporarily placed marijuana in Schedule 1, noting that there was a lack of scientific study on marijuana and claimed that they needed further research to determine its health effects, right? So they were putting it in there just in case, Nixon said. So the 1970 Act it established the National Cannabis on Marijuana and Drug Abuse to assess the medical and addictive effects of marijuana. So the government actually started taking steps to research this themselves beyond just the LaGuardia report, which was like a city-based initiative. Okay, so the commission was put together, and the commission's first report to Congress, marijuana, a signal of misunderstandings. This is what the commission said. They recommended that marijuana no longer be classified as a narcotic, since that definition associated marijuana with more addictive drugs, such as heroin, and misled the public by exaggerating marijuana's harms. They said the government would be capping. Remember I told you guys what capping was last week? Capping means lying, y'all. It means lying. It's not that the government was lying. Like, it would be, you would be capping if you put it in the same category as heroin, okay? Relax, is what the commission said. Yes? You can just shout out. Right. So I think that I think pharmaceutical industries were involved very early. I don't know when it took place, because the reason I'm saying this is in the beginning, it didn't start as with big pharma. It started with Harry Anslinger. It started with big oil. It started with paper. And as it started to build momentum, I think big pharma saw the opportunity to block it as well. And I think big pharma is played more of a major role more recently than they did like in the beginning and the inception of this. Thank you for that question. So the commission basically said you're capping, and it recommended decriminalization of marijuana in small amounts for personal use. What year was this? That's 1970, y'all, that the federal government was telling the federal government to quit this. It's like that Drake song, because myself just told myself. Like the federal government just told the federal government, cut it out. So a second report came out the following year, called Drug Use in America, Problem and Perspective. And it reaffirmed the findings of the first report and again recommended decriminalization. So Nixon said he was putting marijuana in there until he found out that it was safe. He found out it was safe. Twice they told him. He still kept it there. So while the reports in their recommendation to decriminalize marijuana gained widespread support, Nixon ignored them. Nonetheless, even after Nixon initiated the war on drugs by declaring drugs public enemy numero uno in 1971, his administration still maintained a focus on rehabilitation and treatment. So even though they were still, arresting people for narcotics, they were giving them the option to seek rehabilitation under the 1966 Act. So the majority of government funding at the time was dedicated to rehabilitation programs aimed at eradicating heroin use around this time. So that was Nixon, and we all know what happened to Nixon. He had a long, prosperous term. I'm just kidding. They kicked his ass out. He was like, "You ain't in this party no more." Okay. So in 1975, Ford, in his administration, issued this white paper in 1975. It identified marijuana as a low priority drug and recommended that treatment and law enforcement efforts instead prioritize drugs that pose the greatest health risks, such as heroin and amphetamines. So this was Ford. I want to walk y'all through how the policies of the U.S. administration, the presidential administrations, changed over time. So we went from Nixon, went to Ford. Now let's look at our homie Jimmy Carter. You guys remember Jimmy Carter? No? Some of y'all were like, I wasn't even born yet. Okay, there's the internet. That's not an excuse anymore. Okay, let's go. So Jimmy Carter, he actually was very pro-marijuana, pro-legalization. He did not view marijuana as a serious public threat. Jimmy was elected while campaigning on a platform of decriminalization. Jimmy, unlike Nixon, had actually read the papers probably. And he was like, okay, marijuana is not bad. President Carter endorsed legislation in 1977 that would end federal criminal penalties for the possession of 1 ounce or less of marijuana. That never went through. He also wanted to leave it in the hands of the states, kind of like what Biden and Kamala are trying to do, like institute this decrim approach and let the states do what they want. But when Jimmy did that, the states ended up tightening enforcement, because I don't know if you guys know this, most of the arrests aren't done by the federal government. They're done by the states. And I'm talking about marijuana arrests. So we need the feds to step in and keep the states from dragging people to prison. All right, next. So 1980s to 1989, we're getting more into when some of you guys in this class were born, okay? You guys remember this? So 1981, Ronald Reagan, he was an actor. I want to bring this up because he knows how to use the media. Let's talk about what Reagan and his wife Nancy did. So Reagan, he literally cast aside the focus on harm reduction in public health in the 1980s. So remember I was talking about the 1960s, drug abuse was seen as a health issue that needed rehabilitation. Well, Reagan cast all of that out. This was the beginning of restarting to view people, drug addicts and drug abuse, as criminals instead of patients who needed help. So with the help of Congress, he set the war on drugs ablaze. Initially, the feds focused law enforcement resources on cocaine because it fueled, lucrative and expensive Colombian drug trade. But eventually, it started changing into cannabis. So let's talk about how they use the media to raise public alarm. So in 1984, with the rise of crack cocaine, in the use of the media, public alarm of drugs escalated. I don't know if you guys remember, but before Reagan instituted the laws that I'm going to talk about in the next slide, he and his wife got together, and this is how I imagine it happening. They're sitting in bed, laying in bed, and he's like, Nancy, how do I ruin millions of people's lives? Nancy's like, I kind of want to help you on this one. I got you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go on a tour, okay? I'm going to be like Patti LaBelle. I'm going to go on every show. I'm going to just keep telling people that to say no to drugs and tell them that drugs are actually a huge issue in America. And I'm going to keep doing this. I'm going to keep talking until I get these Americans to think that drugs are actually a big problem in America. Once I've gotten them to figure out that drugs are a big problem in America, I can then easily go into communities and take these criminals out and put them into our prisons that will end up being private, and all our friends and family will eat. That's literally how I imagine it happening. Now, no one wants to give me the rights to write the movie. So this is not going to come out. But that's literally happening, y'all. Nancy Reagan started going around the country and launched this Just Say No campaign on drugs. On its face, it appeared innocuous, right? But what ended up happening is, prior to Nancy Reagan going on this tour, only between 2 to 6% of Americans thought that that drugs, period, were a big problem in America. 2 to 6%. By 1989, 4 years later, 64% of Americans believed that drugs were a big problem in America. So that laid the foundation for them to institute the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986. You see how this was done, y'all? Okay, let's get this going. So they started brainwashing us in 1984 and 1985. By 1989, things were already so bad, but they were able to do this because they had gotten into the minds of the people. Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, what did? They budgeted $1.7 billion to the drug war. I'm pretty sure there were kids in this country who couldn't read. People wouldn't have access to dental care. Meanwhile, you're spending $1.7 billion for the drug war, okay? I just realized that I was being spicy again. I can't help it. They impose mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses. They instituted a 100-to-1 disparity between powder and crack cocaine. Do you guys know what that is? If you have 100 grams of powder cocaine, you would need 1 gram of crack to get the same amount of time of imprisonment. Does that make sense? So it's 100-to-1. So 500 grams of powder cocaine is required to get the same amount of time as 5 grams of crack cocaine. The reason that is because powder cocaine is way more expensive, and people from higher classes tend to be able to obtain that. Crack is smoked by Black and brown people in poor neighborhoods, and so that is why they did that. It was intended to target those communities. Isn't that crazy? I mean, it's on its face kind of low-key racist, but Big Mama ain't gonna talk about it. All right, mandatory minimum sentences. Why is this horrible? Because the point of the judge is that the judge should be able to have some discretion, right? They should be able to say, look, I noticed that you might have, sold some crack to somebody, but Johnny, you're in the community, you're helping people. I can see you didn't have a father, blah, blah. You can go and look at the entire human and make a more compassionate decision. Well, after Reagan, judges did not have that right anymore. It stripped judges the discretion to impose fair sentences tailored to the facts and circumstances of individual cases. The act required the judges to sentence individuals convicted of certain drug offenses to a minimum number of years or more. These mandatory minimums were triggered not by a person's actual role in a drug offense or operation, but by drug type and quantity. Ain't that messed up? So the U.S. Sentencing Commission linked its sentencing guidelines to these mandatory minimum sentences. Now, these harsh sentences, they said they were intended for masterminds and the El Chapos of the world. But what really ended up happening, y'all, is that they ended up getting the young kids, a lot of the low-level offenders. And I'll talk about why they get low-level offenders instead of the El Chapos. So I just talked about this 100-to-1 disparity. It imposed the same mandatory minimum sentence upon someone possessing one 1/100th the amount of crack cocaine as powder. So it's kind of, this is a little sad. Any questions so far about how Reagan and Nancy got together? And I make a lot of jokes, y'all. If Reagan is your man, I support it. Just I'm gonna make fun of everybody. No one's immune. Ask my mama. she asks for mercy all the time. Next, we're gonna talk about President George H.W. Bush. Okay, so now I know some of you guys were around when this dude was here. So Bush continued to fight the drug war aggressively. Would you expect anything less? The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1988 created the Office of the National Drug Control Policy. And this was created by his administration by the previous to advise the president on drug control issues, coordinate drug control activities and related funding across the federal government, and produce an annual national drug control strategy. The first strategy report made it clear that a central component of its approach to illegal drugs was arresting more people in targeted communities. I don't know why they write these things in there. Like, just keep this to yourself, okay? Put it on a Post-it note, not in this. Effective street level enforcement means dramatically increasing the number of drug offenders arrested. So, and the reason why this is horrible, drug offenders would seem great if they were talking about El Chapo, but they're literally talking about low-level offenders to a certain extent. All right, next, President Bill Clinton. This is my favorite slide because a lot of people in America love Bill Clinton, and especially people of color, and I need Black people to stop. And after this slide, y'all gonna stop liking freaking Bill Clinton. And Arsenio Hall, shame on you. He probably didn't know. He probably did not know that Bill Clinton was continuing the legacy of the Reagans and Bush, okay? What did he do? He signed the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994, aka the Crime Bill, which provided for 3 strikes. Remember the three strikes rule? Mandatory minimum life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for federal offenders with 3 or more convictions of serious violent crimes or drug trafficking crimes. That means that, you could have been really good for you did 2 crimes, you were really, really great. You fall into some trouble accidentally, and then you are in prison forever. It provided for 100,000 new police officers, $9.7 billion in funding for prisons. What you need $9.7 billion for prisons for? If we're dealing with people who are on drugs, who need health care instead of prisons, but we gonna put them in prisons. Let's keep going. $6.1 billion in funding for prevention programs designed with significant input from experienced police officers. I feel like Killmonger when he was like, "Is this your king?" That's how I feel about him. Sorry for being so blunt, but the facts just can't prevent me from removing the shade that I'm spreading right now. Okay, $2.6 billion additional funding for the FBI, DEA, INS, U.S. attorneys, and other Justice Department components. Why? Because they were getting ready to lock people up. They needed to stock up. So during President Clinton's presidency, he also, that's correct, Ned. Clinton's presidency, drug arrest arose 46%. More Blacks were in prison than ever before in American history. I guess more people. So 46%, you guys, during Bill Clinton. So this is why I'm like, I just don't like when people get love when they shouldn't get love. You know what I mean? But I'm not the love police here. No one's appointed me in that position. But every time I'm like, yo, you guys, I'm gonna let you guys know. Clinton ain't your friend. Okay, so where we at now? Between 2001 and 2010, remember I showed you this? 8.2 million marijuana arrests. 7.3 million, 7.3 were for marijuana possession. 88% of those. So remember when the Reagan's law was written to stop the masterminds, but then 88% of the people that they're arresting for marijuana are only arrested for possession. More than 20,000 people are incarcerated in 2010 for the sole charge of marijuana possession. So that's 300,000 more. So that's 889,000 marijuana arrests in 2010 alone. 300,000 more arrests for all violent crimes combined. Like I mentioned, that's one for every 37 seconds. There were 140,000 more arrests in 2010 than in 2001, and again, 88% for possession. Okay, we see this. Blacks 3.9 times more likely than whites to be arrested for marijuana possession in Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, we're spending over $9 million enforcing marijuana laws. And so that's where we are. I guess at this point, I'm going to stop to ask any questions, if you guys have any questions. You learning anything? Is some of this new for you? Good. I only like to teach new things. All right. So at this point, you guys are like, what are some of the tools that the government is using to sustain the war on drugs? Have you wondered that? I'm glad. Let's get started. Okay, first, there's something. Have you guys heard of the broken windows model? The use of the broken windows model led to increased rates of arrest. So basically, the central premise of this is that the appearance of disorder begets actual disorder. So if you can address minor indicators of neighborhood decay and disorder and crack down on petty offenses, the police will be able to reduce serious crimes attached and fueled by such disorder. So if you, for example, see a group of young kids hang around in front of a store, that is enough, right? That is a minor indicator of neighborhood decay, because that would be a loitering. This is some of the things that they've done. And they would go and that would give them the right to frisk and search these kids. And then if you search them, what you find? Sometimes you'll find a little weed. And if you find weed, what they do, they take these kids and they throw them in jail and ruin their lives. Because that's what the cops, sorry. I'm going to stop with these jokes. But that's what they like to do if they've done it, right? Well, I agree with the theory, but in application it was used in a way that was detrimental.
Oh, for sure.
Because,
for sure.
Because the indicators that they were using were indicators like kids. If you see a bunch of kids walking around, if you see kids with their pants under their butts, like some places were using things like that as indicators of neighborhood decay.
Right. They certainly misapplied what I would equate to things being out of disordered, if you will.
Right.
But
so that was the
overall
issue.
theory is still accurate.
If you let somebody who has certain biases interpret what a sign of decay is, that's when you run into issues, which is where we ran into issues. And a lot of the issues we'll see happen in New York as well. So use of the broken, beginning in the 1990s, police departments began cracking down on minor offenses under the theory that such tactics would increase public safety and reduce violent crime. They implemented order maintenance policing strategies that focused on the enforcement of low level and quality of life offenses. So one of the things that resulted from this theory was stop and frisk in New York. So in 1991, the NYPD made 44,000 stops. By 2010, the number of stops rose to over 601,000. Of the 685,000 people stopped by the NYPD in 2011, 88% of them were innocent of any crime. 87% of the people stopped were Black or Latino. Even though white stop were twice more likely to be found with a weapon. So this broken windows model was used to target specific groups of people, specifically in New York. I mean, you guys know New York was crazy with the stop and frisk. So we talked about the broken window model. Now we're going to talk about Compstat. And again, the theory itself isn't wrong. Compstat itself is not, these are not problems. That's why they're just tools. Compstat is a tool that is also used by the police in order to help crack down on the broken windows model. So let's go. Compstat is a technological and management system that combines police department crime data, geographic information with police accountability. Its purpose, right, is to enable police departments to identify and address specific crime problems very, very quickly and efficiently. They monitor crime patterns by location, resulting in the deployment of police resources to specific areas and neighborhoods. Compstat's accountability system requires precinct commanders to answer for crime rates in their jurisdictions at twice weekly crime control strategy meetings with department heads. So the reason why, so every 2 weeks they have to meet in order to assess how they're doing with their crime rates, which is also measured oftentimes by the number of arrests that they get. So one significant data point that I was talking about, like I was just mentioning, that police use to measure precinct performance is arrest numbers. So using the number of arrests as a performance metric, what does that do? It creates pressure and incentives for police to generate high number of arrests, right? So if you get incentivized by that, you're going to want to arrest more people. So higher arrest numbers are easier to obtain by focusing on nonviolent, low-level offenses, which require far less time and resources, including less experienced officers, than the longer intensive investigations required to make arrests for many serious offenses. So now you see why they would use the broken window model, why they would use low-level minor indicators using this Compstat, because they're trying to keep up with the arrest numbers so that they can meet their metrics. And why do they have these metrics? You're like, why do they even care about arrest numbers? Well, I just went over this slide. Let's see how it does not call for, again, so Compstat does not call for aggressive enforcement of low-level offenses in itself, but when used by police departments employing a form of broken windows, it does encourage aggressive and frequent enforcement of low-level offenses. And calls for heavy policing in areas designated as hotspots. But why? So the reason why the arrest numbers is nauseating to me, has anybody ever heard of this Justice Assistant Grant Program? Well, it's one of the ways that the local state departments, local police departments get funding from the federal government. It's a financial mechanism that's funding the drug war and its accompanying policing strategies. So in 1988, the program was established, and it provides states and local units of government with funding to improve their criminal justice system and to enforce drug laws. So under the JAG program, each state is required to develop a statewide strategy for their criminal justice systems, focusing specifically on drug trafficking, violent crime, and serious offenders, okay? There are 7 general program areas for which funds can be used. You can use it for law enforcement, you can use it for prosecution in courts, crime prevention and education, corrections and community corrections, drug treatment and enforcement, planning, evaluation, and technology improvement, and crime victim and witness. The reason why I went through all 7 is because one thing you'll know is these states do not have to use the money for law enforcement. They don't have to use it for prosecution in courts. They could use it for education. They could use it for drug treatment. They could use it for planning, evaluation, and technology. So you don't really need to be focusing on drug trafficking. Or you can focus on serious violent crimes. Do you see what I mean? But they're really choosing to focus on drugs, especially lower level offenses, because it's easier and cheaper to implement those programs. So of the $500 million spent every year on average in jurisdictions across this country, 50% is used to fund law enforcement activities. So half of it is going towards law enforcement. So under this program, law enforcement agencies have to set their project goals, objectives, and performance measures. Along with reporting the number of investigations and prosecutions, agencies receiving funds for law enforcement are required to report the total number of arrests as part of their performance measures. JAG does not restrict the categories of arrest in its performance measures to felonies or serious drug cases. Rather, all drug arrests, including misdemeanors such as for marijuana possessions, must be reported to the BJA as a condition of receiving federal funds. So those three things together, we talked about the broken mirror model, Compstat, and the JAG program combined are the tools that are really helping to keep the war on drugs going and people getting arrested. All right, so you guys, we now at a point where we know that marijuana has medical has some medical benefits. We know that from 8,000 BCE, we've been using marijuana and hemp for food, clothing, all kinds of things. And from that journey, we walked all the way through into the United States, and we talked about the process of prohibition here in the United States. And then we ended up talking about the tools that are used to sustain the war on drugs. And now I'm going to talk about the Cole Memo. And this is completely shifting gears in the sense that the fact that marijuana is federally illegal in Massachusetts, the Department of Justice still has the right to go into adult use programs and shut it down and put everyone in jail, including Big Mama, in prison for her marijuana activities, right? But I want you guys, have you guys wondered why is it that the federal government has not enforced the CSA against legal marijuana programs? Hola, Ulysses.
What's good?
Nada, yo, I'm gonna finish this two things.
Sounds good.
Okay, so the Cole Memo. So what happened was Attorney General James Cole, when states were starting to legalize adult use programs, he issued this memorandum that told the Department of Justice that they would not that funds would not be used to enforce the Controlled Substances Act against those who are operating in legal marijuana markets, and so long as the state program, the state adult use program, abided by these eight requirements or eight restrictions, the program should be fine and you should be okay. So Cole said, if a state has a legal cannabis program, the program has to make sure that they prevent distribution to minors, that they prevent the sale of marijuana from going to criminal enterprises, gangs, and cartels, making sure that marijuana that there's no diversion from states where it is legal into states that it's not, preventing state authorized marijuana activity from being used as a cover or pretext for trafficking other drugs, preventing violence in use of firearms and cultivation and distribution of marijuana, preventing drug driving and the exacerbation of other adverse public health consequences, preventing the growing of marijuana on public lands and the attendant public safety, and in environmental dangers posed by marijuana production, and preventing marijuana possession or use on federal property. Now, why did I go through this? When we start going through the adult medical regulations, adult use regulations, you're going to realize that Massachusetts has some very strict regulations. And a lot of times people are wondering why. It's because of this memo. Even though Sessions came and repealed the memo, we'll talk about it. In 2018, Jeff Sessions repealed the memo. You guys remember that? But we don't have to talk about what's up. But Andrew Lelling, who is our U.S. attorney, he said that he's just going to keep doing what the Cole Memo asked us to do. So in Massachusetts, we're safe. But the reason I'm bringing this up is you'll notice that when we start going through the regulations, you'll notice that we're not allowed to have guns for delivery in our cars on premises. Why? Because this says that you have to prevent violence in the use of firearms. So Massachusetts, the CCC interpreted that as saying y'all can't have no firearms, no guns or whatever. you'll see things like they're very aggressive with the marketing, advertising, and branding laws, where you can't market. You can barely market in the state, and it's because they're trying to prevent minors from being impacted by being impacted by the marketing. So is that making sense? So you'll start noticing when we go through the regs, I would like for you to keep the Cole memorandum in mind and see how the CCC in the state, the legislature is trying to comply with the Cole memorandum. Even though technically it's been repealed, but Lelling said it's still good. All right. We will talk about equity next week. We talked about it a little bit in the beginning of class anyways. So you want to take 2 minutes and then I'll let Ulysses get started, or should we go right through? Last week you guys said right through. Is it because it feels like you're watching Netflix? All right. You back.
Sorry about that.
Oh, no worries. No worries at all.
Happy to be here, though. You know.
So this is my business partner, Ulysses Youngblood. Ulysses, he has led his family power washing business since 2003. After working the business for over 10 years, he finished his degree in business management. He worked full-time in pharmaceutical and medical device industries as marketing and operations personnel while enrolled in graduate school. In 2014, he immersed himself in energy regulations and acquired the skills in the growing renewable energy industry, primarily selling solar systems. Much like the marijuana industry, y'all, the energy sector is highly regulated and changes rapidly at the local and state level. Ulysses obtained his MBA from Northeastern University in 2016. I left everything out about our relationship and how we met because I think it's a funny story.
No, that's great. I appreciate that. Yeah, and just happy to be here with you guys. I'm sure the class has been, and I tell Laury this all the time, very entertaining, but also educational. And it's one of those things where, like, I compare her to Dave Chappelle because he's so real. He's so real, and he takes, like, real, weighty, like, hard subjects and are able to make them entertaining and funny. So I'm sure it's the same in class here with Laury. So happy to be here. I did have a couple slides prepared.
Ooh, you want to share?
Yes, if you don't mind. It seems like most of you are on mute. Definitely feel free, especially since I can't see you all right now. I'm just let me see if I can expand this. Here we go. And even if I do see, it's 26 of you right now. So if you have any questions, please feel free to like stop and reach out. And I'm also a professor, an adjunct professor at Clark University, and all my classes are online. Are on campus. I have one hybrid class. And my favorite part of class is the two-way conversation. So definitely feel free to stop and ask any questions or comments on anything. And I mean that genuinely. So, so this is, as I mentioned, I teach entrepreneurship and innovation as well as cannabis regulation at Clark University. I teach cannabis regulation in a certificate program that's under the Masters of Public Administration. It's relatively new. It came out this year. They basically just developed this course once legalization happened, or the certificate program, I should say, once legalization happened. And I've just been happy to be a part of it since it got developed and started back in November of 2019. So here we are, almost a year into it. So aside from working at Clark, teaching classes there, I'm also, as Laury mentioned, the co-founder of Major Bloom, and we are an impact-driven cannabis company. And it means a lot to us to be in this space and to share with people. Education is near and dear to both of our hearts, and that's definitely something that we take very, very seriously. And we believe that when it comes to reversing the harms in cannabis, prohibition, that education and entrepreneurship is a big part of that. So it means a lot to be here with you guys, and also to be aside Big Mama. I'm sure you guys know the nickname. So this weekend I was home with my mom. I'm from Connecticut. And she was like, do people call Laury a doctor? And the first thing that came to my mind was Dr. Big Mama. I started laughing, and she was like, "What are you laughing at?" But it was just funny that she asked me that. I'm like, yeah, maybe I should start calling her Dr. Big Mama.
Dr. Big Mama.
Yeah, you like that? You like that? Oh, so yeah, I'm currently at our location here in Worcester. So I live in Worcester. I've lived here for about 6 years, and like I had mentioned, I'm originally from Bridgeport, Connecticut, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But so Laury and I, and it seems like you guys haven't touched on equity yet, social equity, or maybe even the economic empowerment. Is that correct, Lo? Did you guys talk
No,
about
I briefly ran through it in the beginning of class. If they caught it, I support them.
Oh, no doubt, no doubt.
I was
So,
just planting some seeds.
what you say?
I was planting some seeds.
Oh, absolutely. No, it's the best. It's the best seed. And I would say that, so Laury and I actually, we met before the program got developed. And, basically the year or so that we were working together, our relationship was growing stronger, and we figured that we could work together. Then April of 2018 hit, after legalization, obviously, and some other, forming of the agency, the state agency, and the CCC, they put together the economic empowerment program. I knew nothing about it. Let me keep it straight and honest with you guys. I'm definitely not a political dude. I'm business through and through. As Laury mentioned, I grew up in a family business. I studied business undergraduate school. I went to MBA business school at Northeastern, and now I teach in entrepreneurship. So definitely business through and through. And I think a lot of people, and when I say a lot of people, a lot of constituents, a lot of people around Massachusetts were not familiar with this economic empowerment program. It was a very small window. It was a 2-week window, and Laury did everything for us. What I mean by that is not only us, she did it for like 12 other groups as well, Laury?
14, but who's counting?
14? Okay, yeah. So basically, with the EE, there was out of 3 out of 6, basically these criteria that an individual or an entity had to fit in order to get an EE certification. And really, what it is priority review at the CCC level. So very fortunate to be kind of fit within that window of that 2-week window. And these are the qualifications that we basically hit out of 3 out of the 6 that were there. The other ones are not. I'm not sure if we didn't hit them, but these are the ones that definitely stuck out to me. Partly because obviously her and I being Black and of African descent.
What? I'm Black.
Kind of a check mark there. And then also, basically, me and my background, being in the business realm, working with, and my dad's a minister, a pastor, and it was more or less, I want to say the second half of my life where he came along that. So we've always been in the community. I grew up around Black people. I grew up around white people too. But I think, part of demonstrating, that past history of working within those communities definitely helped us kind of get to that role. And then also the promoting of economic empowerment in these areas of disproportionate impact. So I do have a link here, and I can actually share that with you guys at some point, but this is basically a guide, and I'm sure Laury can send it to you as well, or you guys maybe review it, but this is basically a guide of what those criteria are that we basically met to get to the EE certificate program, or the become an EE business. So one of the important things I love about the EE program is obviously that the CCC, they're very, it's crazy because you talk to people who are in the industry or applying, and they're always griping about how the CCC doesn't communicate to them. I've personally never complained about the CCC. I don't complain about much, to be honest with you. Laury can attest to that. I'm more definitely a doer. If there is a problem or an issue that comes up, I look at it as a test in a way to kind of push through those problems. And even when bad things happens, they happen for a reason. So at the end of the day, everything subsides. There's a start and an end, and everything in between is just to kind of get to where your goals are. So the CCC is definitely helping us pursue our goal of getting licensed, because whenever we submit an application to them or reach out to them, they're always, we're always at the top of their list to respond back to. So I'm never in a position to kind of complain about them where other people in the industry might necessarily complain, because they're not in this program. So yeah, it's just been a hoot getting through as far as we have, and just kind of what we've been up against, and make it this far, just basically on the strength of our own
Hold on
wit
one second.
and grit. Yep. Question?
Ned, did you have a question?
Absolutely. And nice to meet you, Ned. And that's a great question. So another point of topic, like I teach social equity, like specifically social equity at Clark in that program. And these are topics that we definitely discuss, and they're definitely known. So not only to the higher education community, not to you guys, but it's definitely known throughout the industry, not only in Massachusetts, but in other states as well, that setting up these social programs could lead to predatory practices. And Laury will definitely probably talk about this, because she's publicly talked out about some of these firms who are, doing this practice. And I won't even say that it's just firms. Like, we've definitely seen large conglomerates, large billion-dollar corporations that use these practices, but they're also like local people. And it's not only people, and it's a great question, because it's not only people who are looking at kind of the foundation of a business and saying, hey, I might be an investor and I want to lend to these people. I can tell you contractors that we've worked with are almost in this predatory kind of mindset of knowing that we are, not as well capitalized, or, not a large conglomerate. And they say, hey, this is a newer program at the state level, and kind of.
It's almost as if they're incentivized to have certain programs like that in order to exploit them.
Yeah, it's kind of tricky. Yeah, we call it cannabis taxing.
Yeah.
So it definitely exists through many different levels, but it's all the same. It's a great question. No matter how you look at it, it's kind of all the same predatory practices. So great question. Anyone else? That's a good kind of stopping point at the slide to talk about economic empowerment a little bit more, or questions, comments. Is there anyone on the line or in Laury's class that knows someone that's an economic empowerment applicant? There's about 150 of us in the state, I believe. But no, that's great. Yeah, and just for context, and diving a little bit more, out of the 150 or so that are EE, I want to say like 13 have provisional licenses, where we have 2 of them, one in Attleboro, where we were working with Linda Maloney on the property there, and then the other one in Worcester, where we are now. And then out of maybe the 13 or so that have provisional license, only one of them are operating, which is Pure Oasis in Boston. So that gives you perspective on, flat out how the program is tough, but it's also failing. And I won't, I'm not calling out the state here, because a lot of states, actually all of them, are failing across the nation when it comes to not only social equity, but most social programs. I like the term social programs, because here in Massachusetts, we have another program called a social equity program. But in other states like California or like Illinois, their social equity program probably would be considered economic empowerment as well. So yeah, just basically social programs is considered like ways to, include other people, almost like the diversity impact plan and the what else is there? The PIP plan, the positive impact plan. So I'm sure these are all things that you guys will talk about.
We're going to talk about all of it, you guys.
So,
Or not. Keep you on your toes. I told you the syllabus flows.
Yeah. And there's going to be a freestyle session the last class.
You know what I'm saying? We got to get some bars. All right.
No, it's great. So no, I appreciate you speaking up there. That's cool that you have some experience as well. So this is one of my favorite terms, kid of the culture, kid of the weed culture. That's definitely me. Oh man, as I mentioned to you guys, I started working in the family business when I was 14, and part of working in that family business, I had a lot of freedom. I, was basically on job sites by myself by the time I was able to drive. And what did that freedom, basically discipline, I should say. So I had a lot of discipline working job sites, but when it comes to discipline, I had a lot of freedom as well. So I definitely grew up like through and through hanging around potheads and cannabis people that consumed. And from that perspective of knowing that, cannabis was not a gateway drug and it wasn't anything bad, I kind of developed a passion for it and a real, heart for the cannabis plant. Did I ever think as a teenager that it would be legal and that I would be, immersed in it and fully taking it on? Hell no, but I think that's the beauty in the story is that if I can do it when it meant nothing, or at least be around it when it meant nothing, then, you know, that's part of the reason why I got into it, is because when I saw the legalization happen, I was not represented. I would reach out to these big corporations that were operating in the medical space, and I shouldn't even say big, but the players that were in the space back in 2012, 2013, 2014, and I would get nothing. And not only was I getting nothing, like I said, I didn't see myself, so I needed to create it because it wasn't necessarily there. I would say another part of what I love about the culture of cannabis is that, without a doubt, it connects different communities, like all different walks of life. I grew up in a middle class household, so I knew some of the rich people in town, $1 million homes that use cannabis, and the same distance down the street in the other direction in the projects, same people use cannabis. So I always liked that it always brought people together, and that's definitely something that I believe in. If it's used correctly, that it can definitely bring people together. And the other part of it is that obviously people use cannabis for many different reasons. I love the fact that it helps people see who they are. That's one of my favorite parts about it, that you really get to know yourself. You know yourself on a creative level, and then obviously there is the medicinal values, whether it's both in the mental side or on the physical side. So I'm definitely not a scientist. I'm not here to talk about or praise the plant for its scientific background, but we all know that it has some scientific and medical benefits, and I think that is part of what makes this this whole thing pretty cool. So I got two. There are two. I thought I had links here, but pretty much just talking about, as I mentioned before, different walks of life. People use cannabis in different walks of life, and the bad thing about that is that people that look like me, look like Laury, are arrested 4 times likely, more or less likely to get arrested 4 times, and that's across the nation. If you look at some different states and some different counties, I think New Jersey is the worst. There are some counties in New Jersey where Black and brown people are 18 times likely to get arrested for cannabis, even though Black and whites use at the same rate. So that's alarming, and that's part of why, again, just being a kid of the culture.
They almost got Big Mama in New Orleans last year. Remember that?
Right. Yeah, you did.
I might have been in jail, you guys. It's crazy.
That is nuts. Oh. So yeah, and and these stories are not isolated. Like, you talk to different Black and brown people, I'm sure they've all had their run-in at some point. So even though cannabis is more legal in about 34 states, there are disparities that still exist. So in states that have decriminalization or depenalization or a medical system, you still see that Black and brown people are getting more fines, or even still getting arrested at higher rates. So obviously legalization, the arrest rate overall decreases, but these statistics and these disproportionate impacts still exist. So questions or comments on kind of my background? I was an athlete. I have that here too. Most of the people that I played sports with, or at least a lot of my good friends, were users at the time, and I would even say now, as we're not professional athletes, but a lot of people's like myself, I played college football. I believe that cannabis definitely helps in that capacity for, again, physical ailments. So yeah, questions on that, guys? If not, we can move on. Comments? All right, very good. So here we are, back to June 2017. Wow. So then I was still working in the solar field, where I was a sales manager, traveling to different communities, talking about the impact of carbon emissions and selling renewable energy systems. I worked for some really, really great companies, making some good money and doing some great things, but I realized that it wasn't enough impact. Basically making 6 figures really wasn't fulfilling enough for me, to be honest with you, knowing that I could have had a larger impact in starting my business. And that's where I met Laury in that journey. It was like, oh, this is cool, like making good money. And Laury was a lawyer too in Boston, making really good money. And we were like, okay, well, cannabis is legal. This is something that we both believe in. And ultimately, we ended up meeting through this group here called MRCC. It stands for Mass Recreational Consumer Council. And they're a lobbyist group, activist group. They also are interested in co-op business work. But I think the part that brought us together is that it was that organization is a nonprofit organization. It was founded by a bunch of young, diverse group. So we had a young lady that went to Harvard, a recent grad from Harvard. She's young. I want to say she's like 26.
Oh, yeah.
Sonia, yep. And then her co-founder was a black kid from Brooklyn. He's also a young guy. Another Filipino kid. So they had a really diverse group, and what they were seeking were other diverse people to bring to their advisory board, professional people. So Laury being a lawyer, and then with my business background, my sales background, they were like, hey, you guys should come be part of our advisory group. And Laury and I met, I want to say it was in June. I'd just gotten back from Mexico. And yeah, we had met, and we had the same aspirations, and we had two different teams. So we were both setting goals to apply for medical in the medical field because the regulations, the medical market, because the regulations for rec weren't written yet. So we're like, all right, well, let's take a look at this medical side of things. And we ended up applying, but it was after that we had came together. So she had a team of maybe like 6 or 7 people. I had a team of like 4, and then we merged those teams together. It took a little bit of persuading on my side. As I mentioned, I have a sales background. I had to take her out on business dates, probably about 5 of them, to talk her into it. She was a little reluctant, but honestly, my big thing is that I know what I know, and I love people who are like really, really skilled at what they do, because I think that I'm skilled at what I do. And I know that the side of things that I wasn't really good at is the regulation side. And just having the confidence to say, hey, I know what's going on. So I think teaming up with Laury, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart, guys, she's a unique individual. When I gave you that Dave Chappelle impression, or that Dave Chappelle comparison, that's really what I look at with this person, with Laury, because trust me, I have friends that have been around cannabis for, at this point, 20 something years. And I know people who are just starting out in this industry as well. So I look at like people who have been around cannabis. I look at people who want to get in the industry, and you don't find like what she does and what we're doing like often. So I'm also very loyal. So I've had the same group of friends since I was like 9 or 10 years old, and I mean that. So they're not surprised at like what I'm doing in this industry now. But I think it's really, really hard to find great people. And yeah, Laury and I met through this group, and there's a lot of work that we have to continue to do, and there's a lot of work that we've done to kind of get to this point, which we'll talk about next in the slide. So anyone else familiar with MRCC? They got a pretty poppin' like Facebook and Instagram page. A lot of information that goes through there, especially locally in the market. No one else familiar? All right, cool. Sounds good. So let's go to where Major Bloom is. Wow. So yes, we are. Wow, licensed with dual license, kind of crazy. And it's crazy because most of the people I talk to that are in the position that we are have raised millions and millions and millions of dollars. There's 2 groups right down the street. Couple of white boys from I think Washington or Oregon. They raised $12 million to get into this market. Of course, they were operating and have cash flow in another market, but the simple fact is that they had to raise $12 million to come in my neighborhood, like right where I am. So I definitely take pride in being like super, super local and actually caring about the community. Why? Because I've been paying taxes here. And then I have a family that's growing up in this community, and I think it's important. That's what we see in cannabis, that local representation is very important. Otherwise, these MOSs are gonna take over, or at least attempt to take over. So as we talked about, economic empowerment, that's back in 2018. And I got to shout out Laury for this and I talked a little bit about confidence before, even living in this city, in Worcester. And, I've been here off and on since 2006. I went to college here at Assumption College. I did end up getting kicked out of Assumption because of some cannabis related stuff. So to me, this is like life full circle, like actually being here. I'm a victim of police brutality as well. Again, not too far away from where the shop is. So to me, this is very, very like deep rooted in like why we have to kind of keep going. And I would not have had the same drive and passion if it was not for Laury. I remember telling her not too long ago that like, I personally, I thought Worcester was too big of a thing. It's almost like, applying in Boston. Like, it's a big city. Worcester's the second most populated city behind Boston in New England. So to me, like, this whole thing is like, oh, you know what? Like, I don't have enough funds or enough wit to kind of get through the host agreement process. And like Laury, knowing as much as she knows about, what's going on and being privy to things, she's like, all right, this is what we need to do. We need to find a location. We need to apply to the RFI, and that's the way that we can get a host agreement. So, the day that she said that what we needed to do, my mindset, again, being a problem solver and someone who's very, very active, I'm like, all right, tell me what needs to happen, and I'm going to start doing it. So, basically out of I want to say like 56 applicants and counting, because still a lot of people still apply to be retail licensed businesses in Worcester. And let me step back a bit. So Worcester, they basically have 75 liquor stores. And I'm not sure if you guys talked about this at all, but most municipalities are meeting that minimum threshold at the state. They're saying, hey, if you're going to take a part of cannabis commerce, then you need to have at least 20% of what liquor stores that you have. So Worcester having 75, they decided that they needed 15 retail licenses to start with. And part of that process was an RFI process where they interviewed, again, upwards to 60 people. And we beat out so a $16 billion corporation. I remember looking at this corporation, doing my due diligence, and just being in awe that we were basically fighting through a giant that was actually down the street from us in an original location that we had, and they were in the same neighborhood as us. And we basically had to, do our, I don't want to say song and dance, but like our best to get through to the host agreement process. And so that's part of Worcester. Worcester had an RFI. In Attleboro, they did not have an RFI. We basically went in there early on with the regulations and kind of told them about what economic empowerment was. I distinctly remember sitting down with the planning board director, and explaining to them, or more or less Laury explaining to them, what economic empowerment was and why it's important for municipalities to go down that route. And the best part about, I will say, this process now is that I know that there are, I want to say 100 or so. There's 351 municipalities in Massachusetts. And I want to say about 100 of them still have moratoriums. So even though there's not a lot of representation in equity and economic empowerment applicants and in social equity applicants, I think there's still hope, especially with the municipalities that don't have, host agreements or don't have regulations yet, because it means a lot to be in there and to tell them why it's important to have those types of businesses like Laury and I's businesses, in their municipality. And I say that from experience, basically tagging along with Lo to explain what that means. So moving on to retail license. So as I mentioned, we do have 2 provisional retail licenses, one in Attleboro, the other here in Worcester. And the important thing about kind of our framework of coming together and kind of getting in this industry is that we knew vertical integration is the only way to be to have a lasting impact in this industry. We can't just be happy with delivery license. You guys will talk about this soon. I believe you will. And even though some regulations just change around that, it wasn't pretty when delivery was only for social equity and economic empowerment businesses. I think the same for retail. You look at other social equity programs around the nation, like in Colorado, whose ship has sailed for their market, and basically now after 6 years they're trying to implement some social equity or restorative justice policies and licensing process. But again, that's deeply revolved around retail businesses. So when Laury and I got together, we were like, all right, the first thing we need to do is find a cultivation spot, which we did in Attleboro. And we ended up getting that permitted for vertically integrated business. Now, the permitted, and when I say permitted, I mean we got a host agreement first for vertical integration. That's cultivation, manufacturing, and delivery. And then we moved on to the special permit process where the local municipality approved the zoning of basically the business operation there. Now, we just did the same here in Worcester, where we had the host agreement for retail only, and then we progressed on to getting an amendment with the manager's office to include manufacturing. And that was actually recently, back in June of, it was back in June of this past year, or this summer. And now that the regulations for delivery have changed, we are going to, and we've actually just submitted our application or resubmitted an RFI to the state for manufacturing, which is a little different, or I'm sorry, for delivery. It's a little different where all the other licenses, you need a host agreement to kick off the licensing process at the state level, where delivery, again, since it was specifically for social equity and economic empowerment businesses, they lowered that threshold, and they basically, and when I say they, the CCC and the governing body allowed you to submit an application without a host agreement. Now, because we do have a host agreement here for manufacturing and retail, it's not as I would say a priority for us to go ahead and chase that at the local level here. But I do owe them an email probably this week to say that we would need another amendment to include delivery. And, part of that, again, going back to even prior to the host agreement, is us looking for properties that fits the build for vertical integration, because we believe that's the best chance to be impactful when it comes to equity in the cannabis industry. And I'll tell you now, I know one other, person of color or EE business that has a license outside of retail. So even most of the provisionals that are for EE businesses that I discussed before, the 13 of those, the overwhelming majority are retail, if not all of them. Maybe one of them is cultivation. So I think we're slated to be one of the first companies to be vertically integrated, EE businesses or social equity businesses to be vertically integrated across multiple licenses. It's pretty cool. But yeah, we just definitely believe in vertical integration for EE businesses, and I think it should be the same across not only this market but all other markets. And it's interesting research once you start to dive into it and look at why the licenses are set up the way they are and why the programs are geared towards licenses the way they are. So long-winded on that point there, and kind of where we are now. We do have an e-com site to build a community and to basically just tell our story and get people engaged. I think it's the same with social media. We've definitely been getting a lot of positive feedback on our social media, and slowly but surely growing. But I'll be honest with you, I have not been super consistent with, the social media stuff, partly because it just doesn't take priority to where we are. I will say that I just recently hired an intern, and as being a professor at Clark, we are probably going to bring on a social media intern as well, or we call a marketing intern as well, to kind of help with these initiatives. I'm sure they're going to grow as we obviously open our doors, but the priority is definitely the build out. So, I'm heading the construction here. It is a hoot because, as I mentioned before, there is a lot of cannabis tax that these contractors have, whether it's civil engineers, architects, people that help out with planning, MEPs, mechanical, electrical, plumbing. And these are traditional. And this is what I like probably the most, is that, like, if you're logical and you could say, hey, would it cost you this much to build a sneaker shop or to do a regular storefront? Then if the answer is no, why are you charging us, more just because it's cannabis tax? Like, no, this is pretty standard. Like, the build out is pretty normal. So I think the biggest part of going through this build out, and the biggest part I would say of, like, kind of going back to the last slide, of being in the cannabis space is just having a network, having a solid network. And I don't even just mean that in the cannabis space. I mean just like people who get stuff done and can help you with stuff. Because I can tell you, man, like when we first got started in this location, we had an architectural plan or architectural proposal that was at 90 grand. It was $90,000. Matter of fact, it was $120,000 because it didn't include the MEPs. And if anyone that has done a build out, you can kind of understand that you start with your architectural plans, which is, you know, your floor plan of where things are going to go, and then you get into the details of where the mechanics are. So yeah, we got one quote for $120,000. Again, that's very, very high up there in the cannabis tax. And then part of us getting this build out done is that, like, once we got to a certain threshold, a lot of people that I talked to about this stuff, they think I was living in a dream or had a pipe dream, but it actually took us to get our provisional license for people to actually kind of take me a little bit more seriously. So a friend of mine that I play college football with, he has a construction business and he helped us out tremendously. You know, his architect's been able to get us work done for sub, you know, $20,000, including MEPs. And that's more traditional of a 5,000 square foot facility. So just to let you guys know, that's kind of the span that, like, kind of going back to the question that Ned had asked, and, you know, it's not exclusive to just, you know, investment dollars. It's definitely all different trades, all different kinds of people that are in the ecosystem of cannabis. And it's, you know, it's a new industry, but let's be honest, there's a lot of traditional things that go on here. So, you know, I hope that is useful information for you guys if you plan on working in the cannabis industry. Just know that, like, you know, try to be as traditional as possible. And, you know, that's part of why, you know, pre-rolls and grams are so expensive, is because a lot of the regulations and a lot of the red tape that people put in their mind, but it doesn't have to kind of be that way if we just, you know, get over the stigmas and things of that nature. So questions, that was long-winded. Any questions on the EE host agreement? Big Mama, shout out to Big Mama, kind of where we are now currently. Oh man, that's a great question. So I'll tell you, man, like the Gantt chart that I created 4 or 5 years ago has been pushed back probably 60 times. And honestly, when I first jumped into cannabis, when I finished graduate school in 2016, I was thinking, and I'm not too far off, I'll be honest with you, I'm not too far off, because I had in my mind that we would open up by 2020. So definitely the goal is to open up by the end of the year. If it's not the end of this year, it's definitely Q1 of next year, because the build out here is not going to take that long. It's actually the state and local inspections that we have to go through. Again, a build out for this place it's nothing true traditional. We have, you know, 30% of it is a retail space. We have a little small kitchen, which is nothing. We have probably one of the biggest inventory rooms, you know, in central Massachusetts, if not for Massachusetts, for a retailer. And an inventory room is literally 4 walls. So we're not talking anything outlandish, but really it's the state and local stuff. So to answer your question, I would say the end of this year, and that's what we're shooting for. And for anyone that's getting into this industry, don't be pissed off if your Gantt chart gets pushed back, because, you know, timing is you can't control it. So it's like, you know, you just kind of have to go with the flow. So great question there. And I get that question a lot, honestly. I get that a lot. So what else? What else, guys? Any other questions out there? Absolutely, absolutely. And that's a great question. And thank you for asking that. So Worcester they used to have a police detailing. I want to say it was for the first 30 days. Now, because of COVID, that might have got pushed back. Now, if we don't need to, and we'll figure that out when I talk about the inspections at the local level, that's part of it. We have to have a meeting with some business department. And there will basically tell us if they would require that. It kind of sucks because they're expensive. But I will say that if we do not require it, or we don't need it because of COVID, we will probably hire our own security, outsourced security. And I'll tell you why. It's because the neighborhood that we're in, I love the neighborhood. Like I said, I live 5 minutes away from it, but there are a lot of crazies around here. It's a low-income neighborhood, and it's a neighborhood that is currently under revitalization. If you guys, anyone familiar with the Worcester, we're right outside of Kelly Square. We're in the Green Islands neighborhood, and one of the first police officers I met actually in this when we were going through the host agreement, he was like, you know what, you could have chose a better location. This location is loaded with a lot of alcoholics and drug addicts, which is true. We see people leaning all the time around this neighborhood. So to us, that's what we wanted. We wanted to be in a neighborhood that needed revitalization and needed a lot of attention, especially for cannabis, especially if there are people who are inherent of using alcohol and drugs. So to answer your question, do we need police detailing? There used to be in Worcester, but I do believe that if we don't, because of COVID, eventually we're probably going to have our own security needs, partly because of those issues that we had. Basically just people being around the neighborhood, being hooked on being hooked on more, alcohol and strung out on other things like that. So, but yeah, police detailing is expensive. So I hope that we don't have to. Yeah, that's actually what we proposed to the city of Attleboro, that we would go appointment only. And I love that model. It is because it is more traditional. I can tell you right now, you just don't show up to your budman's house, or your budman doesn't just show up at the house if you don't have an idea of what you want. So I think being able to use the technology to set appointments, even to do online ordering, and also because of COVID, we're starting to see that now. So it's definitely in our plans. And yeah, I mean, you just queuing, the whole forecasting, like the whole nine. It's just better to use the technology. So that's a great point. So supply chain, actually, that's the reasoning. In many different industries across the board, the producer kind of has control. And to your point, with delivery or retail, you have more of a branding opportunity. You have more of an opportunity to create a connection with consumers, your direct consumers. But our mindset, definitely getting into this, is that we want to be able to take control of production early and often, because we also knew that real estate is finite. I know we didn't talk about real estate at all here, and I'm sure Laury has a point to discuss it, but we knew that real estate was really, really finite. So it's not so much on the cultivation side, as we are starting to learn that, because, retail are the ones with the parking and all the customers, and they got to be 500 feet away from each other, and there's limitations on the local level. They want to be at that 15%, but a lot of municipalities are definitely open to cultivation. There's going to be a lot more opportunity for that. I just think that right now, in the position that we're in, that the cultivators have all the control. And I'll tell you why. Right now, a pound of cannabis in the legal market is upwards to $4,000. It's repulsive. And I can tell you, I can go to Maine right now. I can grow cannabis in my house. It wouldn't cost me $4,000. But they have control in the market because they're the only producers and they're selling everything. So I think our mindset was to take control of that production. And then the other side of it, and you bring up the great point on the regulatory side, is 280E. Laury, have you guys discussed 280E at all yet?
Yeah, this is our second class. Oh,
Yeah.
I dipped a little bit, but not too much.
Great. Now, 280E allows you to essentially, the taxation's on it a little bit differently. So you can, basically benefit from being a vertically integrated business. And I'll let Laury, talk to that a bit. But I think, that was really our mindset, is really knowing that the real estate's finite. Production is more, has more control in the market. And then the 280E is definitely a big kicker.
So basically, you can't take your ordinary business expenses and credits if you're dealing with transactions that have to do with a controlled substance. And so an ordinary business would be able to deduct electricity, employees, and things of that sort, but marijuana retail businesses can't. When it comes to manufacturing and cultivation, the IRS Code 280E allows you to deduct the cost of goods sold. The cost of goods sold is the cost of acquiring the product you intend to sell. So in terms of manufacturing and cultivation, everything is most of the things is a cost of goods sold. Your human resources, your electricity, rent, etc. In retail, it isn't. So in retail, you have an effective tax rate of about 70% at times, which is not reflected in manufacturing and cultivation. And FYI, delivery will be under retail.
Oh, word. What, on a taxable level?
Yep.
Oh, word. Okay, that's interesting. Well, that whole wholesale game should be a little change there, you know. So, but yeah, and I hope that answers your question. That was a really, really great question.
So we don't have a lot of time left.
Oh, word. Well, I guess we can probably just end it there, or end it here, just real quick. I guess, where we see ourselves in the future. Definitely getting more involved with social equity program. Laury did a great job of teaching that class for her other business last year, I want to say, or since the inception of the program. So we're definitely interested in working with other EE and SE businesses. Without a doubt, we want to be where Major Bloom in the future, working on a federal capacity of being able to help these neighborhoods and these communities that have been impacted. I can tell you right now, we are working with a large corporation for a supply agreement, and one of their big issues is they don't have a lot of diversity and inclusion in their program. So when I talk about building loyalty and retention, I mean that across the board for customers as well as employees, because there's a lot of turnover in the cannabis space.
Oh, so much.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. And then the economic development, we definitely, again, we look for properties that, one, we have a chance to kind of revitalize certain neighborhoods. And we, you'll probably talk a little bit more about this when Laury discusses real estate. But yeah, I think that's a good place. That's a good place to end it. So,
Boom.
yeah.
Thank you. Oh my God. Thank you so much for coming.
Well, of course. Yeah. And you guys find me, Ulysses Youngblood, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, and then you can find us. Us.
Unlike me, he responds very quickly.
Absolutely.
People yell at him all the time to me. Like, they'll yell at him so that he can transfer the yelling at me. Like, why doesn't your partner ever answer?
Right. So, but the thing is that she got a lot of people that reaches out to her. So
I don't have an assistant, so it's hard.
Right. But yeah, happy to be here with you guys, and definitely, feel free to reach out. And you're in a great spot being in this class with Lo. She's definitely going to bring a lot of resources to the class. And the biggest thing is firsthand experience, honestly. She's not making this stuff up. It's not a theory. Literally things that we're going through right now. So, and that's why we love teaching so much, is because we have firsthand experience, you know what I mean? So, yes, thank you guys.
Perfect. Thank you so much.